The lid came up with a damp sigh, and earth-chilled air slid across my hands like breath. Under the roots of the old sycamore, a small wooden hatch lay just where the soil turned hard and the grass thinned. I remember the sound most a hollow, cellar-thin echo when the hinge gave way, and the way a crayon rolled toward the dark, bumping once against my knuckle before it dropped out of sight. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I didn't know the shape of a bad day yet. Back then, the world arrived in familiar portions. Morning headlines folded on the kitchen counter, the smell of coffee and dish soap, the whine of our screen door when I let the dog out. Jefferson County in late summer sits warm and heavy with afternoons that push into the high 80s and a lake haze that softens everything at the edges. I was 12, growing tall and awkward with a hairbrush I never quite used right, and a heart that already loved quiet places. 4 days a week I shelved paperbacks at the public library as a youth volunteer, learned the difference between mysteries that told the truth and ones that didn't, and walked the 2 miles home along Maple Street with the cicadas riding high in the trees. The family reunion at Mirror Pines had a rhythm as steady as a metronome. We'd been going there since before I could read the cabin numbers, 17 clapboard boxes drawn up around a shallow lake that pretended to be colder than it ever was. 50 yards of gravel separated the parking loop from the water's edge, and the old recreation hall held onto last winter's wood smoke no matter how wide you threw the doors. Every year Uncle Hank made a chart who was in which cabin, who brought what for the cookout, and what time he'd shout for the group photo near the big sycamore folks, let's go, like he always did. He had a voice that carried, and we trusted it. You can live a long time on that kind of trust. My Aunt Rebecca arrived later than usual that year, the back of her station wagon packed right to the glass with coolers and a plastic tote of floaties. She stepped out in her white sneakers, as if she'd been walking on eggshells all day, and then Maddie came out of the back seat barefoot, her hair pretending to be a ponytail and her cheeks already freckling. She was 5, the kind of 5 that counts ants as neighbors and turns every stick into a pencil. When she took my hand, her fingers were cool and damp from the condensation off a juice box. She had a way of looking up like the sky had just said her name. Jenna met me halfway to the cabins with 2 sodas pressed sideways into one palm and a grin that meant we'd already missed something funny. We were a knot of cousins at that age, moving in loose orbit, not quite children, not quite anything else. The dads unloaded charcoal and a second grill. The moms laid out folding tables and tried to keep the potato salad out of the sun. I counted the familiar markers canoe rack soda cooler, the wobble in the 3rd step on Cabin 7's porch, and then I let the noise around me become background. Some places have a pitch you learn like a lullaby. Mirror Pines was ours, the z's of the bugs in the marsh grass, the slap of a screen door, kids shouting a little too close to the water. It was hot enough that our skin held the day even in the shade. The lake looked glassy and shallow, the color of old pennies near the shore. Uncle Hank wore the same faded cap he always wore, and made the same joke as he checked his watch. Something about how a group photo is what separates a family from a rumor. He moved in arcs, hand on a shoulder, a laugh tossed behind him. The man who'd be there first and leave last. People like that tell you without words that the gate is latched and the porch light works. You don't realize how much you rely on that until the night comes on and you're not ready. I was not a brave kid. I was the one who sat with the smaller children when the fireworks got too loud. I learned their rhythms, when to grab a hand before they tripped, when to give them a minute to figure it out. Maddie liked to draw circles in the dirt with a stick and make up names for them. On that Saturday, her circles were oval and lopsided, each one with a dot in the center. She told me each dot was a person, which was the first time I remember understanding how big her small world was. She didn't need much. A stick was a pencil. A notch in the bark was a mailbox. The scuff of a shoe became a path somewhere important. We set the folding tables under a rigged tarp and started lining up the food. An aunt said the deviled eggs were too warm and someone fetched more ice. The playlist was the same Fleetwood Mac on cassette, a radio station you only got if you turned the dial just so, and kids shouting the parts of the songs they knew. Around 2 o'clock, the heat flattened so hard the shadows looked pressed onto the ground. The sycamore threw a circle of shade big enough to gather everyone in, and the trunk had the kind of pale, molting bark that makes a tree look like it stepped out of its clothes. I'd carved a tiny star there once, the kind of vandalism that pretends to be a love letter. I liked to watch how a day fitted itself together. Hank's voice carried the way it always did 5 minutes to the photo, then we eat. He turned a cardboard box into a stool and set the disposable camera on top of it while he got everyone's attention. 50 feet off, a park ranger we didn't know walked the tree line with a notepad and the patient gait of someone counting things that don't change. The lake barely moved. You could hear the tap of a loose boat chain and the soft clink of ice in a cup. A dragonfly hung in one place long enough for even the little ones to see its wings. Maddie wandered the way she always did. Never far, always near enough to hear her mother laugh. She ran her hand along the lip of the old fire pit and then crouched by the base of the sycamore. I remember the dirt under her nails, and the way she tilted her head at the leaves like she was ready to listen to them if they had something worth saying. Rebecca called to her and smoothed her hair with the flat of her palm as if the touch itself were a blessing. Some families use words. Ours used hands on shoulders, plastic cups refilled before you asked the porch light on. So long the bulb burned warm even in the morning. You couldn't have asked for a calmer day. The thermometer at the ranger's cabin read 86 degrees, and shrinking, the kind of heat that begins to climb down off itself by mid-afternoon. I helped Jenna untangle a string of cheap sparklers, and we told each other the same stories we always told: who got too tall, who got a new job, who promised to bring the good lemonade next year, and never remembered. There's a safety in repetition. Even the splinters in the picnic tables felt familiar. It's strange what lingers: the weight of a paper plate bending in your hand, the sweet vinyl smell of an inflatable ring, a smear of frosting on a plastic knife. I remember how the lake looked metallic at its center, like a coin halfway in mud. I remember the chalk-white ash left in the fire pit from a burn earlier in the week. You could crush it to powder without touching it. I remember a little boy lifting a turtle and an uncle telling him to be gentle, son, be gentle. It was that kind of day. If there were hairline cracks in it, they didn't announce themselves. They showed up the way small things do inside a pause that runs just a beat too long and a glance that doesn't land where it should. Hank asked me to check the cooler for more ice, and I took the long way round the rec hall because that's how 12-year-olds move when nobody's rushing them. Inside the room was cool and smelled faintly of mildew. Along the far wall, a corkboard held old flyers, lost keys, a softball schedule that had already happened, a watercolor of the lake signed with a name I didn't know. Hanging crooked near the bottom was a notice about safe shoreline distance for children, minimum 6 feet from drop-offs. Whoever wrote it had underlined 6 feet twice. I remember tapping that underlining with my finger as if emphasis could turn the ordinary world into something you could enforce. Outside again, I heard the soft, rhythmic chuff of the ranger's boots as he made a pass along the waterline. He paused near the canoe rack and wrote something, then looked into the trees as if counting. People who watch for a living don't stare. They slide their attention like a hand over a table feeling for crumbs. He made a slow pivot and kept going. I wasn't the one he was watching, but it felt for a second as if we both knew there are kinds of quiet that don't belong to us. We drifted toward the sycamore a few minutes after 2, that late afternoon light that turns grass into brushed brass. I took up my small duty: get the little ones toward the front, keep the squirmers from disappearing behind taller people. The circle of shade felt cooler than it should, as if the tree made weather of its own. The bark at shoulder height was smooth under my palm. A little lower, where a child's hand might rest, sap had wept and dried in a thin amber tear. It's odd, the things you carry with you for decades, the particular shine of that sap, the way it caught a fleck of sunlight and held it like a secret. Rebecca adjusted the bow in Maddie's hair. Hank raised the camera and cracked a joke about all of us blinking at once. I lined up with Jenna and felt the dirt give a little under my sneakers where roots pushed toward the surface. Somebody laughed loud enough to start the chain of other laughs. The radio found its station again, and a woman's voice slid in across the clearing like something from a porch swing. The young kids fidgeted. The older cousins tried to look like they weren't posing. I counted heads the way I always did, 1, 2, 3, because most safety is made out of little habits nobody taught you to name. We had a family way of marking time. Before the photo, after the photo. Before we eat, after we swim. Later, we'll walk the loop. Later, we'll light sparklers. I can still see the line of paper napkins trapped under a mustard bottle so they wouldn't blow away the way the lake reflected the sky. So exactly it made the shoreline look cut out of paper. The air tasted like mineral water. If you stood still, you could hear the birch leaves clap together and the thin metal rattle of an unlatched locker door at the boathouse. The world was ordinary in a way that lets a person put their guard down without meaning to. I keep thinking about the small decisions we make without the ceremony they deserve. Where to stand in a picture, whether to tie a shoelace, which hand to hold. That afternoon, I smoothed the front of my shirt and stepped half a foot to my right so a little boy could see past me. It didn't matter then. It shouldn't have mattered. But the mind tries to draw maps around grief. It looks for the inch that might have changed the mile. I saw the ranger one more time before the shutter snapped. He had moved to the edge of the clearing and was writing again, a deliberate hand, the pencil making a compact sound against the clipboard. He lifted his head and looked at the sycamore as if he were memorizing its shape. Across from him, Hank raised his voice on that cheerful note that meant, "Here we go, eyes on me." Count of 3. The heat eased just a fraction. The radio cut to static and found itself again. I felt a breeze that didn't reach my face. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder lightly as she stepped forward to stand behind her girl. I remember how cool her fingers were. The light pooled a little on the dirt. Someone said, "Ready." I looked at Jenna. She smiled without showing her teeth the way she always did when she meant, "This is fine." I looked down for half a heartbeat and saw near the base of the trunk, where the soil baked hard, a faint white half-moon of chalk, like the memory of a child's hand. Somebody laughed again. The sound bumped against the leaves and came back smaller. Hank lifted the camera higher to catch more faces. I shifted my weight and felt that shallow give in the ground where the roots breathe. The lake made a small decisive sound on the shore, as if a rowboat had nudged the chain. The picture hadn't been taken yet when the first quiet thing happened. My aunt's watch beeped once, one bright, lonely chirp, and she never reached to silence it. She just kept her hand on her daughter's hair, the bow not quite even her nails clean and square the way a mother's are when she's been washing fruit and cutting watermelon for an hour. The watch beeped again, and nobody laughed about the timer. The radio faded just a little as if a cloud passed where there wasn't one. That's how a day like that leans. Not with thunder, not with warning, with a pause that stretches and a breeze that doesn't arrive. I remember the feel of Uncle Hank's voice drawing breath to say 3, the air a hair cooler under the tree, the ridge of bark against my palm, and the breathless, weightless second before the shutter clicked when the phone in the ranger's pocket began to ring and he didn't reach for it. The ranger's phone rang once and fell quiet like even the woods didn't want to hear it. The camera shutter clicked, a small sound swallowed by the air, and in that instant, the day seemed to settle. Everyone smiled the way you do when you've taken the same photo for generations, half serious, half impatient. The adults started drifting toward the picnic tables, and the kids, myself included, scattered toward the cooler. It felt like summer always had noisy, safe, predictable. I remember Maddie tugging on her mother's sleeve, asking if she could have another popsicle. Rebecca laughed, handed her one, and told her not to get it on her dress. It was cherry, the same print she wore every year, the one that never survived a meal without stains. Maddie licked her popsicle barefoot in the dirt, humming to herself. That's the last full picture I have of her. Not a photograph, just a memory framed by sunlight and sound. After that, the details blur into the shape of ordinary moments. The grown-ups were busy with the food. The cousins took turns daring each other to dip their toes in the lake. I was sitting near the edge of the clearing writing names in the dirt with a stick when I heard someone say, "Where's Maddie?" It didn't sound panicked, just curious. A casual passing question, the kind families ask all day long. "She's with Becca," someone answered. But she wasn't. The voice came again, louder this time. "Rebecca, you got Maddie." My aunt's reply cut through the chatter. "She's right here somewhere." The words hung there, uneasy but not yet afraid. That's how it starts, not with screaming or sirens, but with small hesitations that slowly become the only thing you can hear. I stood up without thinking, scanning the picnic tables. She wasn't with the twins, not near the fire pit. I jogged toward the rec hall, calling her name softly because I didn't want to make it a big deal yet. That's what I told myself. Maddie. My voice bounced off the walls, too bright, too certain. No answer. Out the back door, the light shifted, the kind of late afternoon glare that bleaches everything pale. I looked toward the sycamore again. Its branches moved slow and heavy. I thought I saw a bit of color there, maybe her dress, but it was only a streamer caught on a branch. By the time I came back, Uncle Hank had already started walking the tree line. He moved with purpose, but not urgency. He'd done this before, found a lost shoe, a kid hiding under a canoe, a game of make-believe that got too real. He called once, twice. Madeline. Still nothing. 15 minutes passed before anyone said the word missing. You could feel it changing through the mood. Laughter faded first, then music. One cousin turned off the radio without a word. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, like the woods were listening. Someone called the ranger station, and 2 men arrived on foot with radios clipped to their belts. I remember their calm. They asked simple questions. What was she wearing? When did anyone last see her? How long had it been? Rebecca couldn't answer. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the path between the trees like she could pull Maddie back by will alone. I'd never seen my aunt look like that, not scared exactly, but suspended like she was waiting for something to rewind. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the cabins. By then, people were walking the trails in pairs. They checked bathrooms, cars, even the lake's edge. When the first flashlight beams appeared, that's when I knew it was real. A ranger with a dog started circling the clearing, the animal's nose to the ground, tail stiff. Rebecca called Maddie's name over and over, her voice cracking on the second syllable. Somewhere behind me, a little boy started crying, and another mother pulled him close. I don't think I'll ever forget that silence, dozens of people trying not to panic, each one of them pretending they believed the next call would bring her running back. By nightfall, the campground had turned into a grid of flashlights. You could hear them clicking on and off, the static of walkie-talkies, the low murmur of instructions. Stay within sight lines. Call out every 30 seconds. I sat on the steps of Cabin 3, hugging my knees, staring at the dirt path that led toward the sycamore. The air smelled of pine sap and cold metal, that scent flashlights get when the batteries heat up. My uncle moved between the searchers, his voice quieter now. Tired. The ranger came by once to speak with him, their words too soft to hear. When he walked past me, his boots left small prints in the dust. That's when I noticed something near the fire pit. One clear mark of a child's foot toes, splayed heel faint. Barefoot. I pointed it out, and the ranger crouched down, tracing the outline with his thumb. He looked toward the trees, then back at me, and nodded without speaking. The search went on until nearly dawn. They brought in more dogs, more lights. I remember standing by the lake when the helicopter passed overhead, the beam sweeping across the water in slow, rhythmic arcs. It lit up the treetops, the cabins, the picnic tables. Every surface looked washed out unreal. You couldn't tell where reflection ended and ground began. Rebecca was sitting near the ranger's jeep, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red and unfocused. People spoke around her, not to her. I stayed close to my uncle, though he wasn't saying much either. He just kept rubbing the back of his neck, whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer. By sunrise, they'd taped off the clearing. The official trucks came next, county police, search and rescue units, a news van that parked near the entrance but never got footage. The air felt different then, like the forest itself had changed overnight. The humidity had dropped and the light was sharper, colder. I stood near the sycamore again, where the group photo had been taken less than 24 hours earlier. The tarp was still up, half-collapsed corners flapping in the breeze. Beneath it, paper plates and soda cans sat exactly where we'd left them. Even the mustard bottle had tipped over but not spilled. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel like rest, more like the world holding its breath. Detectives arrived mid-morning. They asked everyone to stay put. One man in a brown jacket spoke quietly to my uncle, then started taking statements. They asked me too what I'd seen. I told them Maddie had been sitting near the base of the tree before the photo said she was looking up at something. They wrote it down, but didn't ask what she'd been looking at. Maybe they thought it was just a child's daydream. When they were done, they thanked me and walked off. That night, the rest of the family drove home except Rebecca. She refused to leave. She stayed in one of the ranger cabins, sleeping in fits, asking every few hours if they'd found new prints or fabric, anything at all. I went home with my parents, but my mind stayed there, fixed on that one clear footprint by the fire pit. The next few days blurred into television coverage and unanswered calls. The story reached the local stations, first child missing from family reunion at Mirror Pines, then spread across the state. I watched it from our living room volume turned low. They showed a picture of Maddie holding a sparkler, her face lit in mid-laugh. The photo looked warm and happy, but I couldn't stop thinking about the second one, the one we'd taken that day before she disappeared. It hadn't been developed yet, but I remembered the way she'd been smiling, how her bow had slipped to one side. For a while, that image was all I had to hold on to. Weeks later, the photo came back from the developer tucked into a yellow envelope with the rest of the roll. We were sitting around my uncle's kitchen table when he opened it. The edges were curled colors faded from the sun. He flipped through a few, then froze. I knew which one he'd found. Everyone leaned closer. There we were, the whole family lined up under the sycamore, squinting at the camera. And there was Maddie, front row, barefoot, her hair smoothed flat. But behind her, just at the edge of the trees, stood someone else. A girl. She was small, maybe 7 or 8, pale, her bangs cut straight across her forehead. She wasn't part of the family. No one recognized her. And the strangest part, she was looking directly at the camera, expressionless, as if she'd been waiting for the shutter. Nobody said a word for a long time. The air seemed to leave the room. Finally, my uncle whispered, "Who is that?" But it sounded more like he was asking himself. Rebecca took the photo, studied it, then pressed it to her chest like she could block the image from view. "That's not possible," she kept saying. I remember thinking how washed out the whole picture looked, overexposed, the kind of light that eats the edges off everything. You could almost believe the figure was just a trick of glare. Almost, but not quite. That night I dreamed about the tree. I could see it clearly. The bark, the hollow near the base, the mark of small fingers pressed into the dirt. In the dream, the air was heavy, not frightening, just thick with something unspoken. I woke before dawn and sat by my window watching the first gray light creep across the street. For years after that, I told myself what I'd seen in the photo didn't mean anything. Maybe a local kid had wandered too close. Maybe the camera caught a reflection. That's how you keep living. You make ordinary explanations out of impossible things. But even now, I can still feel it, that hollow in the ground under my feet, the way the air turned before anyone noticed she was gone. Some memories don't fade. They settle in layers waiting. The summer of 1994 never really ended for me. It just went quiet, like the woods after the last voice calls out a name and gets no answer. And somewhere in the stillness of those trees, a barefoot print still waits in the dirt, holding the shape of a moment that never let go. When the years started to stack up, the photographs became the only way I could still look at that day without it undoing me. They sat in an old cedar box beneath my desk, dog-eared, sun-faded, and smelling faintly of smoke. I didn't take them out much. Every time I did, it felt like stepping backward into air that hadn't moved in decades. But in September of last year, my mother asked me to scan a few of them for a family slideshow. My Uncle Hank had passed, and everyone wanted something familiar to look at during the service. I remember sitting at the dining room table that night, the lamplight spilling across those curled corners, and thinking how ordinary grief can look until it turns its head. I wasn't expecting anything more than nostalgia, just the comfort of faces I hadn't seen in years. But then I turned over the picture, the one from the reunion at Mirror Pines 1994, and my breath caught. I'd seen that photo 100 times before. We all had. It was the last one taken before Maddie disappeared. But I'd never looked past her before, never really seen the background. This time the grain was sharper under the scanner, the colors more balanced. And there she was. Behind Maddie, half hidden in the light, stood a child I didn't recognize. A barefoot girl in white overalls, her bangs cut blunt across her forehead, watching the camera like she'd been waiting for it. Not smiling, not curious, just still. I zoomed in, thinking maybe it was a reflection or a trick of the film. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. She wasn't washed out or transparent. She had detail, the creases in the fabric, a faint smudge of dirt on her cheek, one bare foot planted on the grass. She looked alive. I pushed the laptop back and stared at the ceiling for a while. You tell yourself memory plays games that you've simply forgotten the extra cousin, a neighbor's kid, some tag-along who got caught in the frame. But my family isn't big enough to lose faces like that. We know every name, every birthday, every story that gets told too many times at Thanksgiving. This girl was no one we knew, and once I saw her, I couldn't unsee her. I called my cousin Jenna, who had been standing beside me in that picture, and asked if she remembered another child at the reunion. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said, "No. There were just us." Her voice changed when I told her what I'd found. She asked me to send the scan. I could hear her breathing when she opened it, the kind of slow exhale that doesn't want to turn into words. "She looks like she's in front of the trees," Jenna said, "not behind them." I didn't answer, but she was right. The light didn't line up. The shadow on her leg went the wrong direction. That night, I went digging for the old albums. My mother keeps them in the hall closet, stacked in plastic tubs, each one labeled with years written in fading Sharpie. I pulled out every binder that covered the late 80s and early 90s, the years before Maddie vanished. I sat on the floor with them spread around me, flipping through page after page. Birthday parties, lake trips, barbecues. It felt almost comforting until I saw her again. Same overalls, same expression, same small, pale hands. This time it was 1983, 11 years before the reunion. Another family picnic at the same campground. I was barely a toddler then, sitting in the grass near my father's feet, and she was in the background, just beyond the group, standing in the shadow of a tree. She hadn't aged a day. I closed the album and leaned against the wall. My ears were ringing that hollow kind of sound that happens when silence gets too heavy. The house felt smaller somehow, the air tighter. I stayed up past midnight, comparing the two photographs, holding them side by side under the lamp. The pattern in the overalls matched exactly down to the stitching. Even the strands of hair that crossed her forehead were identical. I could have convinced myself it was an old photo someone had accidentally double exposed, but these were different rolls, different cameras, different years. It was impossible. By morning, I'd convinced myself to be rational about it. I took both photos to a friend of mine who teaches digital forensics at the community college. She's the kind of person who doesn't flinch at much. I asked her to take a look, see if there was any evidence of tampering or printing errors. She ran the scans through her software, comparing pixels and exposure layers. After a while, she took off her glasses and said, "They're authentic. No editing, no overlay." The images were true to their negatives. She asked who the little girl was. I told her I didn't know. It should have ended there, but curiosity has its own gravity. I pulled more albums from my aunts, my cousins, anyone willing to dig through storage. Over the next week, I found her in 9 separate photos spanning almost 3 decades. Sometimes she was clear as day. Other times she was half hidden, blurred by motion. Always in white overalls. Always barefoot. Always near a child between 4 and 7. In one picture from 1971, she stood behind a boy I didn't recognize. He had been maybe 7 years old, laughing at something off camera. The caption beneath the photo read, "Troy's birthday." I asked my mother about it, and her face went still. "That was your uncle's friend's son," she said. "He went missing that summer." That's when the line between coincidence and something darker started to blur. I wrote down the names from the captions and began cross-checking them against missing person databases. Most were small-town cases, disappearances near campgrounds, lakes, parks. Some solved, most not. When I entered 3 of those names together, an old news archive popped up. Cherryville girl vanishes without trace, 1972. The article showed a first-grade photo of a child named Evelyn Cross. She was 7. Brown hair, brown eyes, the same blunt bangs, the same white overalls. My stomach went cold. She had gone missing 2 decades before Maddie. I spent the rest of the night reading every line I could find about her case. Evelyn had disappeared from a trailer park 40 miles from Mirror Pines. The search had lasted a month. No evidence, no body, just a note in the final report. Case closed, family relocated. Her name had fallen out of public record since then, but I couldn't stop staring at her picture. If you placed it beside the figure in our reunion photo, they could have been twins or the same person. I knew how insane that sounded, so I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. The next morning, I called the Jefferson Township Police. I asked if anyone had ever reopened Maddie's case. The officer on the other end paused before saying, "No, ma'am. That file's inactive. I mentioned the photograph, the possibility that it connected to older cases." He didn't dismiss me outright, but his tone softened in that polite way people use when they're steering you off the road. "You're welcome to bring it by," he said, "but those files are 30 years old. Doubt we'll find much." I thanked him and hung up, realizing how quickly an investigation can die when nobody's looking anymore. That weekend, I drove back to Mirror Pines. The campground was closed to the public now, overgrown, the cabins sagging under their own roofs. The entrance gate leaned against a post, the chain rusted but loose. I parked just inside and walked the path to the clearing. The air was cooler than I remembered, sharper with that damp smell of pine needles rotting into soil. The sycamore still stood there, taller now, the carvings in its bark stretched thin. The fire pit had collapsed inward, filled with leaves. I sat on the old stone bench and laid the photos across my lap. They looked smaller out here, more fragile. In the breeze, the edges fluttered like they wanted to turn away. I whispered Maddie's name once, just to hear it out loud. It sounded too loud, too private, like speaking in a church after hours. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a branch snapped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, and tried not to look. I gathered the photos, tucked them back into the envelope, and started down the trail. That's when I saw him, a man sitting on the steps of a weathered cabin nursing a coffee mug. His face was older than the one I remembered, but I recognized him. Hal Emmerich, the ranger who'd been in charge of the search the summer Maddie vanished. He watched me approach, then nodded like he'd been expecting company. "You're one of the Reeves girls," he said. "Clara, right?" I told him yes. I figured, he said, tapping the mug. "You look like your uncle. Haven't seen any of you folks in years." I hesitated, not sure how to begin. Finally, I handed him the envelope. "Do you remember this?" I asked. He slid out the top photo and stared at it for a long time. His hand trembled slightly. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I remember." He set the photo down and leaned back. We never did figure out what to make of that footprint by the pit. The dogs tracked 2 scents that day, Maddie's and another smaller one, barefoot. We assumed she was following someone, maybe a friend she made. But the second trail just stopped. I asked if anyone had mentioned that in the official report. He shook his head. "No, the department didn't like loose ends. They said we'd confuse the family." He gave a short, humorless laugh, as if they weren't already living in confusion. I told him about the girl in the photos, how she appeared over decades unchanged. I half expected him to smile, politely dismiss it, but he didn't. He looked at me with an expression I still can't name, part recognition, part dread. "You're not the first to notice her," he said quietly. "I saw her once myself. Long before Maddie. Different kid, same face." The wind picked up through the trees, bending them into a low, steady whisper. He told me about a boy named Troy Benson who had disappeared from the campground in 1971. Hal had been new on the job, then barely out of his 20s. The search turned up nothing. But a photograph from that summer showed the boy at a picnic table, and behind him, barely visible, was the same barefoot girl. "She doesn't change," he said, his voice cracking. "I've tried to forget that picture for 50 years. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The woods seemed to breathe around us, the sound of leaves brushing together like quiet applause. Finally, Hal said, "Whatever she is, she's not just a ghost story. Some things stay because we keep remembering them. Others stay because we can't." When I left Mirror Pines that evening, the sun was setting in long golden slats through the trees. I drove in silence, the photos resting on the passenger seat beside me. At a stoplight, I looked down and noticed one of them had slipped partially out of the envelope, the one of Maddie smiling up at the camera, the girl in white just behind her. For the first time, I realized the girl wasn't looking at the lens. She was looking at me. I put the photo back, careful not to touch the image, and kept driving. In the rearview mirror, the trees along the road blurred into a single line of green and shadow, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing among them, small, barefoot, and still. I didn't stop to check. Some things once seen have a way of following you home. When I got home that night, I locked the photos in a drawer and sat at the kitchen table with every light off but one. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence like a clock I hadn't noticed before. My mind kept looping back to Hal's words. "She doesn't change." I tried to tell myself he was just an old man with too many ghosts, but the way he'd said it, quiet and certain, wasn't the sound of superstition. It was memory. I poured myself a glass of water, though my hands shook enough to spill half of it, and I kept thinking about the look in his eyes. Not fear, recognition. The next morning I drove back to the library where I work, half hoping the routine might settle me. The place still smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, same as always. I sat behind the desk sorting returns, but I wasn't reading the titles. I was watching the old microfilm machine in the corner, the one that used to jam every 10 minutes. I hadn't touched it in years, but that day I turned it on and began scrolling through the Jefferson County archives. I searched for every article that ever mentioned Mirror Pines. Most were dull fishing permits, family reunions, a small wildfire in 1979. But every decade or so there was another headline, always the same phrasing: child missing near campground. Search continues. The names changed. The years changed. The place didn't. Around noon, I pulled one last reel from the drawer, July 1963. The film was grainy, scratched, but clear enough to make out the front page. The photograph stopped me cold. A group of volunteers lined up along the lakeshore holding lanterns, search dogs at their feet. It could have been any search, any era, except for one small figure on the edge of the frame. A little girl standing apart from the others, barefoot, wearing overalls. I pressed my hand to the glass, tracing the outline of her hair. Same blunt bangs, same distant stare. Someone had typed the caption beneath "Searchers gather at dawn for missing boy Mirror Pines, 1963. I printed the page and folded it into my coat pocket. The whole afternoon passed without a word to anyone. By the time I closed up the library, the sun was sinking low behind the courthouse, and I decided to stop by my uncle's house, or what used to be his house. Rebecca had been living there alone since he passed the same old porch light still burning, the same wreath hanging out of season. She answered the door slower than she used to, smaller somehow, as though the years had been pressing her inward. We sat in the kitchen where the ticking clock had never been replaced. I laid the new photograph on the table between us. She didn't speak right away. Her hands hovered over the page like she was afraid to touch it. "You found another," she whispered. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "I keep seeing her too, Clara. Not just in the pictures." She looked at me, then her eyes bloodshot, tired. "She comes in dreams, standing under that tree calling to Maddie. Every time I wake up, I hear her say, 'Come see.'" I wanted to dismiss it, to tell her grief can echo so loudly it starts inventing new rooms. But something in me hesitated. Maybe because I'd seen that same outline in the trees on my drive home, or maybe because deep down I knew this wasn't just imagination feeding on memory. Rebecca went quiet for a while, staring at the wall clock, the steady second hand sweeping its circle. "Your uncle used to say that land wasn't right," she said finally. "The soil under those trees is too soft even in drought, like it's been dug and filled again." I asked if she remembered anyone doing maintenance out there. Maybe an old septic line, anything that could explain it. She shook her head. "No. But he once said he found a wooden hatch near the roots of the sycamore, half buried. He covered it back up and never spoke of it again." The word hatch stuck to me all night. By dawn, I was back at Mirror Pines with a flashlight and a small shovel. The air was thick with fog so dense it felt like walking through breath. Dew dripped from the leaves collecting in the folds of my jacket. I moved through the clearing until the sycamore came into view. The ground beneath it was damp and uneven. When I pressed my heel down, it gave slightly, just as Rebecca had said. I knelt and began to dig small scoops at first, then deeper. 5 minutes in the metal edge of my shovel struck something solid. Wood. I brushed away the dirt until a square outline emerged, weathered planks bound by rusted hinges. A latch hung crooked at one side. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. For a long moment, I couldn't make myself move. The forest was dead silent. No birds, no wind, just the drip of condensation from the branches above. When I finally lifted the hatch, a breath of cold air rushed out so sudden it made me gasp. Below, a narrow shaft disappeared into darkness, maybe 10 feet deep. The smell rising from it was old damp stone and rust and something faintly metallic. My flashlight beam caught the curve of a wooden ladder descending into the earth. The first rung crumbled under my touch, but the next held. I climbed down slowly, one hand on the wall, one holding the light. At the bottom was a small room carved from packed soil and stone. It couldn't have been more than 10 feet wide. The walls were lined with drawings, hundreds of them, all done in crayon. Trees, doors, circles, and shapes that looked like children holding hands. I recognized the handwriting, the uneven scrawl of a child's grip. At the center of the back wall was a small wooden box, the lid carved with a single word, Maddie. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a cassette tape labeled only with a date 9/20/94, the day she vanished. The recorder on the shelf above it was old but intact. I pressed play. At first only static, the hiss of age, then a voice faint but clear. Maddie's. "She says we're going through soon," she whispered. "To the between room where it's soft." I stopped breathing. The tape clicked, hissed again, then went silent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely rewind it. When I did, the same voice repeated the same words, but this time another sound layered behind it, something like wind or movement too low to identify. Then the tape ended with a soft thud, as if something had been dropped near the microphone. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to nothing. Eventually, I noticed a tunnel extending from the far side of the chamber, sloping downward. The air pouring from it was colder than the room itself, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I followed it a few yards before the dirt gave way to rock, then to brick. Old bricks, hand-laid edges worn smooth. Every few feet, the beam of my flashlight caught another set of drawings on the walls. New ones darker in color, more frantic. Circles around circles, figures without faces. Then at the end of the tunnel, the passage widened into another chamber. There, in the center, stood a door. Small, maybe 3 feet tall, painted a deep shade of blue that hadn't faded despite the years. It had no handle, just a round brass knob and the faint outline of fingerprints smudged across the paint. I reached out, half expecting it to dissolve like a dream, but it was solid, cool to the touch. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The door opened without resistance, revealing another space beyond darker. Still, the air heavy with the scent of soil and something sweet like rotting flowers. From somewhere inside, faint but unmistakable, I heard a child's voice. It was Maddie's. She was calling my name. The sound froze me where I stood. It wasn't a recording. It was coming from beyond the doorway, soft and close, like she was standing just out of sight. "Clara," she said again, her voice trembling but calm the way she used to call when she wanted me to follow her to show me something. My mind screamed to run, but my body didn't move. Instead, I stepped forward. The ground underfoot felt soft, like walking on carpet soaked with water. The air pressed in warmer now, pulsing faintly as if the room itself were breathing. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. For a moment there was nothing but blackness and the faint echo of my own heartbeat. Then from somewhere behind me I felt the air shift, a whisper, a hand brushing my shoulder, though no one was there. I turned, but the passage was gone. Only the door remained, now shut tight, no knob, no seam where it met the frame. Panic rose in me like cold water. I hit the surface with my fists, shouting, but the sound went nowhere. And then, just as sudden, everything went still. The ground firmed beneath my feet. The air cooled, and I was standing back in the first chamber. The box still open at my feet, the recorder silent. I climbed the ladder without thinking, breaking one rung as I went desperate for light. When I surfaced, dawn was breaking through the trees, gold against the mist. The hatch lay open behind me, the earth around it undisturbed, as if it had always been there, waiting. I walked to the car in a daze. Every sound amplified, the crunch of gravel, the hum of insects, the pulse in my ears. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was up, but the forest behind me still looked half asleep, heavy with shadow. I didn't speak of what I'd found for days. How could I? Who would believe it? But 3 nights later, just past midnight, my phone rang. It was the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. A young deputy said they'd found a child walking along Route 16 barefoot and dazed, answering to the name Maddie. She was 5 years old, the same age she'd been when she vanished. I remember gripping the counter to steady myself. The deputy said she was unharmed, though confused. They'd taken her to County General for observation. I drove there before dawn. Through the glass of the observation room, I saw her small pail sitting on the edge of a hospital bed. Her hair was the same length her cheeks, round her eyes wide. Time hadn't touched her. When she saw me, she smiled faintly like no years had passed at all. "You came," she said, her voice as soft as the recording. "She said you would." My knees nearly gave out. Before I could speak, the nurse stepped between us, guiding her hand gently back to her lap. "She's in shock," the nurse said quietly. "She doesn't remember much." But Maddie's gaze never left mine. It was steady, patient, and old in a way that made my throat close. I realized then that she hadn't aged, but she hadn't truly returned either. Something about her felt distant, like the echo of someone who'd lived too long in another world. When I stepped out into the hallway, the deputy handed me a file. "We'll need to talk later," he said. "There's something strange about where she was found." I asked what he meant. He hesitated. The spot where she came out there was nothing there but a hollow under an old oak, like the ground just opened and set her down. He looked at me uncertain. "Ma'am, do you know what she meant when she said the between room?" I didn't answer. I just walked to the parking lot, the sun rising low behind the hospital, and sat in my car until the light reached my hands. When I finally looked down, I realized there was dirt under my nails, red damp soil, the kind that clings from digging. I brushed it away, but the smell of it stayed. I thought of the hatch, the drawings, the door. And for the first time in 30 years, I wondered if some doors don't lead anywhere at all, they just open to whatever still wants to be found. For weeks after that night at the hospital, I couldn't bring myself to step back into the woods. I told the sheriff everything I'd found, the hatch, the drawings, the tape, but by the time they sent a team out there, the clearing looked untouched. No opening in the ground, no chamber, no ladder. Just roots, damp soil, and the same sycamore that had watched us all for 30 years. They didn't accuse me of lying, but I saw the look they gave each other, the one people wear when they're filing you away under trauma talking. They closed the area off again, said it was unstable, dangerous. The hatch, whatever it was, had vanished back into the earth. Maddie stayed under observation for 2 weeks. She answered to her name, she remembered her mother's face, but nothing else. When they asked where she'd been, she said things like in the soft place or with the quiet girl. Doctors blamed dissociation, said she was building metaphors for what she couldn't process. Rebecca didn't care what they called it. She sat beside her every day, holding that small hand, brushing her hair into the same uneven ponytail she'd worn that summer. It broke something in me to watch, seeing time move for everyone except the one who'd been gone. She looked just as she had the day she vanished, same cherry print dress, same scuffed knees. Only her eyes were different, darker, somehow steady in a way a child's shouldn't be. When they discharged her, she came home to a house that still smelled faintly of the candles we'd burned every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. The front porch was lined with flowers from neighbors who didn't know what to say. Miracle, they called it. God's hand. The local paper ran her photo again beside the old headline, as if rewriting the story could undo what time had done. But behind closed doors, Rebecca and I both knew it wasn't that simple. Maddie slept little. She spoke even less. At night, she'd wake up and stand in the hallway staring toward the front door. When Rebecca asked what she was doing, she'd answer softly, "She wants to come in." We tried not to ask who she meant, but after a while you could feel it like a presence that settled into the corners of the house. One morning I walked in to find Maddie sitting on the floor by the window tracing shapes in the condensation with her fingertip. Circles within circles, the same drawings from the chamber walls. "It's a door," she told me without looking up. "She says you'll find another one soon." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like she was repeating instructions. I knelt beside her, trying to keep my tone light. "Who says that?" She turned her head toward me and smiled faintly. "The barefoot girl." I didn't have an answer for that. I wanted to comfort her, tell her it was just imagination. but the words felt wrong in my mouth. That night, when the house was quiet, I took out the old photos again, the ones with the barefoot girl standing behind her. I compared them to the picture the hospital had taken of Maddie during intake. There was something in the angle of their faces, the shape of the eyes, that almost mirrored each other. Not identical, but echoing like two versions of the same melody. I closed the folder and put it away. Some connections don't belong on paper. In the months that followed, people tried to make sense of it in their own ways. Reporters called from across the country wanting interviews, photos, anything that could make the story neat enough to print. "Lost Girl Returns After 30 Years, the headlines read. But they never got the details right. They didn't mention the footprints by the fire pit or the cassette buried under the tree. They didn't talk about how in every photo from every decade that same barefoot figure stood somewhere near a child who later vanished. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe it wasn't the kind of truth that fits in a newspaper column. Rebecca moved away the following spring to a smaller town 2 hours north. She said she wanted somewhere quieter, somewhere Maddie could grow up without people staring. I visited a few times. The house always smelled like cedar and lavender. Maddie liked to sit in the yard digging small holes in the dirt and filling them again, humming to herself. Once, when I asked what she was doing, she looked up and said, "Planting doors." I laughed softly, thinking she meant flowers. But then she pressed her palm to the ground and whispered something I couldn't make out. When she lifted her hand, the dirt was damp, though it hadn't rained in weeks. It's been a year now. The authorities never reopened the case. Officially, it's closed. Recovered safe, no foul play. That's the language they use when something defies explanation. But I still get letters, people who saw the old articles, parents who lost children near lakes or forests, asking if I think their sons or daughters might come back too. I never know what to tell them. I write back carefully, honestly. I say that sometimes the world gives us back what it takes, but never in the shape we remember. A few months ago, the Jefferson County Historical Society reached out. They were digitizing old photographs from the region and wanted permission to archive the reunion picture, the one taken under the sycamore in 1994. I almost said no, but something in me wanted to see it one more time before letting it go. When the file came through, the image was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. They'd enhanced the contrast, sharpened the edges. Maddie's smile looked almost alive again. But what froze me was the figure just behind her. Not the barefoot girl this time, she was still there, pale and watchful, but another shape, taller, standing just behind her shoulder. A woman. The face was partly in shadow, but the posture, the hair, even the angle of the head, it was me. I stared at it until the room tilted. I told myself it was a trick of exposure, a fold in the light, but deep down, I knew better. Somehow, I was already part of that picture before it was taken, a fixed point in a circle that had never stopped turning. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, the hum of the old ceiling fan filling the silence. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees, slow and patient. I could almost hear a child's voice in it, soft as breath. She says we'll go through soon. Sometimes when I drive past the old road that leads to Mirror Pines, I still feel the urge to turn in. The sign's gone now. The cabin's collapsed, the lake half swallowed by reeds. Nature has a way of reclaiming what we pretend to forget. But every time I pass, I think about that day, the sun through the branches, the laughter the moment before everything shifted. And I wonder how many doors have opened and closed in the years since, how many still wait under the soil. They say photographs capture light, not time. But I've learned that light can lie. It remembers things we don't. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to find the photo box sitting open on my dresser, though I never leave it that way. And once, just once, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass frame beside my bed. Behind me, faint but visible, stood a barefoot child in white overalls, her eyes steady and unblinking. She didn't move. She didn't need to. I didn't turn around. I just sat there in the dark until the first trace of dawn slipped through the curtains and her outline faded with it. I still don't know what she is, a ghost, a memory, a shape the world keeps making out of loss. But I know she's still out there, somewhere between the trees and the light waiting for the next picture to be taken. And I think when the time comes, she won't be alone.